Hello and welcome. My name is Françoise Mathieu, and I'm a mental health professional, the executive director of Tend Academy, and a specialist educator on topics related to secondary traumatic stress and provider impairment. We have been getting a lot of questions recently about terminology in the field of provider impairment, particularly the proposed replacement of the long-established term compassion fatigue with what many believe is the more accurate term of empathic strain or empathic distress. Although this may seem of little to no importance to extremely busy service providers who work in the front lines each and every day, as you will see in our discussion today, having clarity about the meaning of terms has potentially important ramifications for research and implementation science. So to explore this shift in nomenclature, I have invited some of my dear friends and colleagues from the field of secondary traumatic stress to join me in a conversation today. I'm going to begin by briefly introducing my panel, and then we'll dive right in. I hope that you, my dear panelists, will not mind that I had to shorten your impressive bios for this discussion. So Dr. Ginny Sprang is a professor in the College of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry at the University of Kentucky, and she is also the executive director of the UK Centre on Trauma and Children. Ginny is also the principal investigator of several SAMHSA-funded research grants, including the Secondary Traumatic Stress Innovations and Solutions Center. Ginny is a recognized leader in the field of child and adolescent trauma treatment, as well as in the field of secondary traumatic stress research. Her work involves the creation of translational tools and the development, testing, and implementation of evidence-based treatments and practices to treat those exposed to these traumatic experiences. Dr. Brian Bride, coming to us from Georgia, is the director of the School of Social Work at Georgia State University. His research and teaching interests include the areas of behavioral health care, primary and secondary traumatic stress, health services research, and workforce well-being. Brian is also the recipient of many grants, including some from NIH and SAMHSA, and Brian is a developer of the Secondary Traumatic Stress Scale, and is considered to be a distinguished scholar as well as a highly influential researcher in the field of social work. In addition, Brian was the editor-in-chief of Traumatology from 2011 to 2018, which is a journal published by the American Psychological Association. I'd like to mention as an aside that Brian and Ginny and other members of the secondary traumatic stress field and I had a chance to meet for one of our very first think tank conversation in 2015. And the results of those conversations were published in 2017 in an issue of Traumatology. Diana Tickes is a registered social worker in the province of Ontario and a specialist in the areas of resiliency and secondary traumatic stress. In addition to being a content expert and trainer for Tend for over a decade thus far, Diana has worked in the healthcare sector for the past 30 years. Over the course of her career, Diana has worked in emergency department crisis teams, coordinated hospital-based sexual assault, domestic violence treatment programs, and has been engaged in many community-based projects, including working a few years ago with the judicial system in the province of Ontario. We had a large-scale sexual assault case review, which is often referred to as the Unfounded Cases Police Review. Diana is also the developer and instructor of a series of training programs for Tend on staying grounded in stressful work and safeguarding tools. Diana's expertise in providing resiliency skills to healthcare providers has been a significant part of her work during the past 10 months of the pandemic. I think that's fair to say, right, Diana? So thank you, all three of you, for joining me. So if you don't mind, we're going to jump right in. And Brian, I'm going to start with you. And people may not know this about you, but you were kind of there when the sausage was being made, so to speak, at the very kind of early iteration of this. So would you mind providing our listeners to a brief history of the emergence of the term compassion fatigue? How did this all start?
So Charles Stigley, who was one of the first to start writing about secondary traumatic stress, he began to understand the notion of secondary traumatic stress through seeing colleagues and friends who were clinicians leave the field and talk about the impact on them of working with traumatized populations. And so he first began talking about secondary traumatic stress disorder as a parallel to post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, remember, this was in the 80s. The DSM, or the PTSD within the DSM, was fairly new. It did not recognize indirect exposure as a type of exposure for post-traumatic stress disorder. So he began writing and talking about secondary traumatic stress disorder as a way to bring attention to the issue. One of the concerns he began having was that in talking about secondary traumatic stress disorder, that that term might be pathologizing, and that clinicians might be less inclined to want to identify it as experiencing the process, where his goal was to kind of destigmatize the process and normalize the process as something that we should be identifying with and dealing with and addressing. So he eventually introduced the term compassion fatigue as essentially a less stigmatizing kind of, I like to say, a warm and fuzzy term that people would be more likely to be able to identify with if they were experiencing it. Part of the confusion, I think, that occurs around the term compassion fatigue is around the same time Carla Joinson, who was a nurse and writing in the nursing literature, also introduced the term compassion fatigue, but not necessarily within the context of trauma. So her version was around nursing and the really kind of the compassion. I mean, it fits compassion fatigue very well. It's the prolonged exposure to difficult situations with the patients, causing nurses to be able to have a lessened ability to love, nurture, and empathize with their patients. And both of these came out early 90s at the same time.
And also then, Brian, so when the professional quality of life self-test was developed, and I apologize because now it's in the 5th iteration, so I don't remember if the first one was like this, but at some point this test kind of suggested that burnout, work-related burnout, and secondary traumatic stress exposure, that those two things combined were being called compassion fatigue. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. So that occurred a little bit later. The compassion fatigue self-test was initially developed by Charles Figley. He then began collaborating with Beth Hudnall-Stamm a little bit later, and she kind of took over the evolution of that scale. He gladly handed it off to her. But as she did her work, she began to conceptualize compassion fatigue as really secondary traumatic stress in terms of the specific DSM type criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, and burnout as a kind of co-occurring process. That compassion fatigue then was the umbrella term that encapsulated both of those occurring.
Great, thank you. And I think a very quick summary of that is that these terms came out of a real desire to bring to the forefront this notion of provider impairment that had not really been recognized. I mean, there was a little bit of discussion of exploration of this with Maslow and Freudenberger and others in the 80s and 70s looking at burnout, but this was really a well-intended movement. And in a way, we're kind of in a messy terminology piece, but I wanted to make sure when we have this discussion that we are in no way blaming or criticizing people who were really trying to be advocates, right? That this was really all well-intentioned, and the messiness is maybe perhaps inevitable. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Part of the messy kitchen part. Okay, thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
Diana, can I turn to you and ask you to explain a little bit to our listeners, why did the term compassion fatigue become perceived as problematic, and why do you think the term empathic strain is actually a better term to use?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Françoise. So I think the term compassion fatigue implies that our compassion gets tired, or our compassion at work is fatiguing in some way. And this simply isn't true from an experiential perspective and a neurophysiological perspective. So through a growing body of literature and research, we actually now have a far more accurate understanding of the terms compassion and empathy. And I think for years, and even today, we tend to use those two terms interchangeably. And they're really quite different in that they activate different neural networks in the brain, and emotionally and behaviorally, the outcomes also are different. And so let me just kind of delineate each of those terms a little bit more. So empathy quite literally means to feel with. And in our helping work, that usually means that we're feeling with the pain of another, the suffering of another. And brain imaging research shows that the same pain neural networks light up in the brain if we are ourselves experiencing the pain or if we are witnessing the pain of another. And so as we feel this pain, quite naturally, the way we're wired up, the way we're built, is that we want to avoid pain. We want to withdraw from the pain. And so we do that in I think, a non-conscious attempt to protect ourselves. And so for me, I think when we repeatedly are resonating with another person's pain, as we do in empathy, this starts to cause distress, this starts to cause strain in our helping role, and ultimately that ends up being depleting and shutting us down, kind of cutting us off. Now, compassion, on the other hand, is a very energizing emotion, both neurophysiologically and behaviorally. So the definition of compassion is our ability to recognize the suffering of another without taking on that suffering as our own. And here is a really important piece. It's also combined with an authentic desire to want to alleviate the suffering of another. So compassion motivates us to help. It connects us. And as a result, we release feel-good hormones like dopamine and oxytocin. And oxytocin is a bonding hormone, again, connecting us. And these things, right, promote pro-social behavior. And so, just as a way to kind of illustrate this for yourself, if you reflect for a moment on when you feel that you've really connected with somebody and helped them, you really feel like you've helped them, do you walk away from that encounter, even if they have been in pain or suffering? Do you walk away feeling depleted? Do you walk away feeling indifferent? Not usually. I think when we really believe we've helped somebody, we typically walk away feeling energized, connected, and like we've done something good, like we've contributed. And so what this says to me is that it tells us that our helping work has the potential to be hugely fulfilling, rewarding, and energizing. However, I think much of our training has emphasized empathy and has also interchangeably used empathy and compassion. We confuse those two things, or we talk about them as if they are the same thing. And so, so I don't think our training as helpers typically involves specifically learning compassion skills. And research does show that compassion skills are easily and quickly taught, and they change the brain in a few short weeks of training. And so I think the field that's ahead of us in this kind of thing is the field of mindfulness, because they certainly have very specific ways that they cultivate compassion skills, cultivate connecting with feelings of friendliness and altruism and so on and so forth. And I will just say, and ending here, that the work of Drs. Kristen Neff and Dr. Christopher Germer, who have developed a compassion skills training called Mindful Self-Compassion, has been really helpful to me. And Kristen Neff particularly is one of the foremost researchers in the area of compassion. And they talk about 3 components of compassion that I think we need to purposefully cultivate. The first one being mindfulness. So that is our ability to recognize suffering. So if we're not aware, we can't have, we can't be impacted if we don't even recognize that somebody else is suffering. So we need to be able to recognize the suffering, but in such a way that we are not taking it on as our own. So we're not over-identifying with it. So mindfulness skills help us to recognize and walk up alongside suffering without taking it on as our own. The second component is common humanity. That really allows us to recognize that we're all part of the imperfect human race. We all, as human beings, suffer. There is not a single person on the planet that has never suffered. And so in this way, we stay connected as a human race. Some of the research shows that we're more likely to feel empathy if the person is like us. And so, you know, being able to purposefully cultivate common humanity is so crucial. And then the third component is the action component, the kindness piece, whether that be kindness to other or kindness to ourselves. And what that really does is that it motivates us to alleviate suffering by doing something, even if that suffering is simply listening and bearing witness to someone's experience, either our own or other, with a kind presence.
Perfect. Beautiful, Diana. And as you're mentioning this, I will post some resources below the recording. And one of the things that I've had the pleasure of doing recently is looking at our dear friend and colleague Brian Miller's manuscript for his upcoming book, which is, I can't wait for people. It is absolutely an exquisite work of art that anyways, I don't even have words for how exquisitely beautifully written it is. And those of you who are not familiar with Brian Miller's work, looking at his CSERT model and how that really breaks down those various components. And Brian in his work has always said, you know, that he really did not like the analogy of the hazmat suit. He really didn't think that we had to suit up in order to protect ourselves from people. And he has this beautiful piece where he talks about we need to prepare to have our hearts broken over and over again so that we can actually be in a relation. So I could digress, but it's really exciting that there are some models out there right now, including CSERT, that's really exploring this piece. And I'm going to turn to you now, Ginny. And I have two questions for you. And the second one is about CSERT, since you've been really engaged in that as well. But may I ask you, as a researcher, and wearing that hat, why do you believe that clarity about nomenclature matters? For research purposes and others, why are we taking this time to have this clarification conversation?
Well, thank you, Françoise. I think, you know, naming things is part of our general human communication network. This is, I think, at its finest, an acknowledgement and a respect for nuance. So frustration, for example, is qualitatively different than rage. So when we're detecting threat, for example, our brain's alarm is going to ring louder when faced with someone who's raging at us than to another who is just frustrated with us. And so I think our response to these two presentations would be very different. And the same applies to the discussion today. So secondary traumatic stress as a trauma condition activates different neurobiological responses than maybe empathic strain or some other type of stress response, like maybe burnout or moral distress, and it requires a different action. So as a researcher, my job is to isolate and measure this mechanism of action that produces change in an independent variable. So if I don't have conceptual clarity, I don't know what it is that I'm studying, any results that I achieve are not really going to be meaningful or useful. And if our peer-reviewed journals are doing their job, the study would never get published. So if you're confused, for those listeners that are saying, well, wait a minute, I've read the literature over the years and I see all these different terms being used, it's really because the field has evolved. And the findings that we've kind of discovered along the way have really produced a more clear understanding of what these constructs are that we're measuring. And that's, I think, probably why we're having the discussion today. I'm guessing that because things have evolved and changed, we need to have a discussion about, you know, what are the terms and what has research told us. I also want to speak as a clinician too, because any good clinician knows that the effectiveness of any treatment is contingent on it being the right treatment for the presenting condition. And evidence-based treatments, that's what we are proposing, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, the National Center on PTSD. All major professional organizations are promoting evidence-based treatments, and they really require that we map conditions to interventions that can reasonably improve symptoms and functioning. So we need to know what conditions we're treating or studying if we're going to be relevant or effective.
Amazing. So would you mind speaking briefly about the CSERT model?
So the CSERT model is really a components-based kind of approach to practicing within your practice. It's really the notion that as professionals, there are ways we can conduct ourselves in the moment, in the midst of a clinical encounter, in the midst of a day where you may be exposed to reports or court testimony or doing assessments, that we can stop and ground ourselves and really pay attention to what's happening in our bodies, what types of responses we might be having, and to be able to control things like our ruminations about things that happen during the day, about down regulating when our parasympathetic nervous system gets activated, and being able to kind of calm ourselves down. It's about developing a conscious narrative around what am I doing as a professional? What is my purpose? Am I masterful at what I'm doing? And as an aside, there is emerging research that really tells us that when we develop a conscious narrative and we can have a positive frame on the work that we're doing and the experiences that we're having, that it does increase compassion satisfaction and can perhaps be a moderating variable that turns down the effect of indirect exposure, and that actually can keep us from experiencing secondary traumatic stress so intensely. So the CSERT model is kind of a practice model. It's not a treatment you go get after the fact from a psychotherapist. It's we are the therapist and we are managing our own professional experience if we're enacting CSERT.
And that's very exciting as someone who's been in the field for a really long time. And as an educator who meets people every single day who are asking us for tools. I mean, every day. Diana, you have a very recent example of that, speaking to a large hospital where people were like, tell us, how do we fix this? Give us, very complex questions with a very short amount of time. I think it's really exciting to have a tool that can actually be enacted. People can learn how to use it, in the moment. So Brian, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question than what we had planned. So I was wanting to think if you wouldn't mind putting on your editor hat, which I know that you were an editor for a very long time. So the problem here is that this field is over 25 years old, although for some people they think it's relatively new, but this field of secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, whatever you want to call it, is over 25 years old. We have 25 years worth of research, of keywords, like how from the kind of the field of the research, but also publication and academic journals, where do we go from here? How do we handle all of that with the nomenclature confusion or lack of clarity? What do you think?
Yeah, so usually what can address issues like this is the publication and dissemination of a consensus statement from a group of experts, I believe. The challenge is there's as you said, 25 years of different variations of compassion fatigue as a term. And there have been publications around trying to find conceptual clarity, but those have largely, I think, focused on identifying the problem of lack of conceptual clarity rather than trying to find a solution to that. I think that's what has probably been missing, is an effort such as this, or probably a written statement from a recognized group that can say, this is what we as experts believe. And then I think there could be some debate about that, but ultimately that I think is what what changes the situation. I think the real challenge has been there, we've talked about maybe 4 or 5 versions of compassion fatigue. There's a lot more out there, and each article takes it a slightly different way. So yeah, I think there really is a need for us as experts and some of our colleagues to just kind of definitively say, this is what we're talking about. This is what secondary traumatic stress is. This is what compassion fatigue is or isn't, and what do we mean by that? And I think from a scientific literature perspective, that's how fields evolve, right? It's not unusual. Just as post-traumatic stress disorder evolved by talking about very different terminologies, it came to one, but it also still recognizes that there are different types of trauma and that those may have different impacts. So it's part of the scientific process. So it's not unusual in that, but I do think it would be helpful for people to begin to kind of come together on what this is and what it isn't.
Thank you. Ginny, did you want to add something to that?
Well, I was just, kind of reflecting on my experiences over the last 30 years going to professional conferences. And I know that, for many years, when we talked about traumatic stress in general, we were talking about it in a very narrow way. We were talking about it in the context of, combat veterans that were coming back and reporting this phenomenon that we were calling PTSD. And it took a long time for us to begin to understand that this is what is also happening in following child sexual abuse and physical abuse and sexual assaults. And we began to broaden our definition, refine it. So when you said that what's happening with secondary traumatic stress parallels what happened in the whole field of PTSD, it is just another manifestation of traumatic stress, and it takes a while for us to really refine and understand that.
Thank you, Ginny. And I'm actually going to turn to Diana in a second. I wanted to give a bit of context to our listeners for my question. One of the things that, two of you know, and Diana knows as well, but one of the things that we've been involved in all of us in the last 5 years, since we started kind of this journey in 2015 of starting to have these conversations, which, Brian, as you say, that was the aim of the very first kind of think tank that we co-created, kind of wanting to talk about terminology and begin that. There were some very polite, but also pretty exciting bun fights about stuff, which I remember. But one of the things that came as a result of that process was what I love to, I think anyone who's met me knows I love to talk about our Venn diagram because it's one of my favorite conceptual tools, and it's iterative and it's evolving, right? So just as Ginny, you were saying, it is not fixed in time. And in fact, the Venn diagram, we added a circle, and we may add more, who knows? We added a circle in 2016 to look at kind of the social, kind of geopolitical, elements, and how that was really influencing and affecting providers as well. So Diana, in a very brief way, which I know is challenging because the Venn diagram is so complex, but would you mind letting folks know, first of all, what is this Venn diagram I'm speaking of, and in what way do you think it's a helpful tool for folks?
Okay. So the Venn diagram is basically an overlapping, is a conceptual model, as you say, of overlapping circles that bring together the various terminology in the literature and the various experiences that I think that we in the field have in regards to the impacts of doing helping work or provider wellness, if we want to use that term. And so I really like the Venn diagram because it really looks at all these different factors. It shows, in fact, how it delineates the complexity of the whole issue, and it shows how some of these factors, or all of these factors, quite frankly, I think, are related, yet they're different. It also shows that we can experience some, or all of these, sometimes almost simultaneously. And I think too, very importantly, and what you were describing, is that it very much takes an ecological approach, which says that these factors are interconnected, and some are more maybe individually based, some are more systemically based, culturally based, environmentally based, and that all these factors exist in dynamic interaction, meaning, again, that they impact each other. And so, why is this important? I think it's important because as we start to look at how we're being impacted, it's important that we consider all of these things, and not just simply consider solely the individual components of the diagram or solely the systemic components of the diagram. Because I think what happens is that historically, what I've seen in workplaces is that as workplaces, recognize the impacts of provider wellness and how that impacts client care and service and all those things, that many have jumped on the what I'll call the self-care bandwagon, or the wellness program bandwagon. And I think the problem is that of course ignores the many systemic factors that also contribute to the impacts of doing helping work. And it's also quite subtly blaming, because we will inevitably struggle with these factors throughout the course of the day, the week, our careers, most definitely. And when we do, if there's only been a self-care message, then we think that somehow it's my fault because I simply haven't done enough self-care. And that's also simply not true, because we also know that some of the most effective strategies are not self-care based strategies. They're things that we do together as a team. There are ways in which the organization supports us in doing the helping work. So we also need to take on or look at those systemic factors. However, I'm going to say, I also find that sometimes folks, and when there's been too strong of a self-care message, I am seeing, maybe more often those on the front line kind of rebelling and then putting all their eggs in the systemic basket, right? It's because of these systemic issues that I am struggling with my workplace stress. And so it's up to you out there to fix that for me. And so I like the Venn diagram because it really looks at, we need to take an approach and we need to identify the individual as well as the systemic factors that are unique to our own experience and our own workplace. So first we identify what those are, and then again we can build in the strategies and the practices that are individual as well as systemic practices. For me, it's always about both and not either or. And again, that's where I think the Venn diagram is truly rich around this.
Thank you, Diana. As an aside, before I go to your final thoughts, all of you, I was a witness to a Twitter storm this weekend, and it started, they were all medical residents or surgical residents, which, as we all know, being a surgical resident is an incredibly demanding, very exhausting experience. And we are recording this during pandemic times, so you can just only imagine their level of stress. And the Twitter storm was around their hospital sending them mandatory resilience training and mandatory wellness webinars. And it really blew up. And I think it was really interesting. And I know one of these surgeons, and he's a friend of my daughter's, and we had a really good dialogue the other day about, my concern about also throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But it was really interesting to also listen to him and say, what makes you so angry about these programs? And I agree with you. I think that becomes very either or as well. Like it's all bad or I don't feel supported. And I really was encouraging their leaders to dig and find out, what is this pushback really? What is this really about? Right. So in the interest of time, I just wanted to see perhaps starting with you, Ginny, any final thoughts for our listeners about this? And then I'll go to Brian and finish with Diana.
Well, yes, I did want to say just something about what do we do about these conditions that we've mentioned, because that's the whole point of nomenclature and getting it right, is because it guides us into what we do and how we can be effective. And so I just wanted to make the point that if we, started with secondary traumatic stress, that, STS is a trauma condition, and we've got decades of research now that tells us how we can decrease symptoms and improve functioning. And so, these things are, these interventions are packaged as evidence-based treatment. So it's like cognitive processing therapy, EMDR, prolonged exposure, a number of different CBT approaches. And, some of those have some very common elements: psychoeducation, emotional regulation and coping skills, some way to process memories of traumatic experiences, some way to process cognitively what's happened to you, and address cognitive errors, replace those with healthier cognitions, and then identifying and managing emotions, and then some ways to alter memory processing. That's common across all of those. And all of those kind of components are very effective in treating secondary traumatic stress. These are all driven by a good assessment that says, yes, it's a traumatic stress condition that you're dealing with, like secondary traumatic stress. And, we wouldn't use one of these kind of interventions for somebody who didn't have a trauma disorder, like empathic strain, which is probably not a trauma disorder, but could coexist with a trauma disorder. So, you don't want to use one of these big, powerful treatments for something that is a different type of stress condition. So it would kind of be like taking care of that pesky fly in the house with a shotgun instead of a fly swatter, And I definitely want to echo what Diana said, is the organization has to do its part. Whether it's STS or empathic strain, the organization has to kind of coalesce around the individual to decrease the toxicity of the environment.
Thank you so much, Ginny. Brian, what are your final thoughts?
Well, Ginny made me think that it's really, I think, important that we point out that we're talking about secondary traumatic stress and how it's different from compassion fatigue and how empathic strain relates, but that we're not trying to say that everything that occurs in response to working with traumatized populations is necessarily secondary traumatic stress. That indeed, empathic strain's part of the picture, and it's a mediating variable. Burnout can occur and often does. Physical health problems, all sorts of different things do occur, and we're not trying to say secondary traumatic stress covers all of those. It covers a portion of those, and as the Venn diagram indicates, there's all sorts of different connections, and those provide different opportunities for change and intervention to help really begin to deal with the secondary traumatic stress problem.
And so what we still haven't been able to find is our umbrella term for the entire experience. Although, maybe provider impairment is fine, I'm not sure. Maybe that's for another day and another debate. But I think that we still need to find a way to explain this to folks, right? For frontline workers, educators, and so on. Thank you, Brian. Diana?
Yeah, well, I think, what this conversation has illuminated for me is, and I think this is actually really emerging and a new way to think about this is as CSERT highlights, is that it's about practice models. It's about what we are doing in the moment that is going to help us navigate the impacts of doing our helping work. And I think that is just so revolutionary in many respects, because I don't think many of us have been trained as in the moment. So in the moment, am I being stuck in empathy? And I think empathy very much, the pathway is it contracts us, it disconnects us, like our whole body even tenses up. And so when we can identify that in the moment and move into, so I'll use compassion, move into shifting into compassion skills, which I think automatically starts to soften us, starts to open and expand us, so we don't need that hazmat suit, right? I often think about it, kind of the story that I'm bumping up against. Let me make myself so spacious that it just moves through me, as opposed to when I contract, it's going to stick to me. And so, you know, as I open and then I can connect, I can be with that person. And so what that then does, I think, is it supports the positive impacts of our helping work. And so, and there are many of those, right? So let's help each other to really utilize practices and skills. And again, I think the thing about a practice is that we're going to get pulled away, right? Because of how we're wired up, we're going to get pulled off track all the time. And when we think about this as a practice, and using the Venn diagram, we can identify, okay, where am I going astray? And that helps me come back, helps me recognize what is the next step that I need to take. And in this way, we just keep putting one foot forward after another. So I'll leave it at that.
Beautiful, Diana. So I'm going to say something a little provocative before we're done, because why not finish with a bang? I have more and more over the years of, you know, really deeply reflecting on this and working with thousands of service providers. I really believe that this awareness is also can become an act of social justice. I think that, you know, I began my career as someone who was not actually being, I mean, yes, I was experiencing some elements of secondary traumatic stress. I was a crisis provider. But what really fueled me at the very beginning of my career 25 years ago is I was witnessing patients and clients being re-victimized, being profiled, being minimized, you know, all of the things we know. And I didn't have the words at the time, but it's so clear to me now that what has really fueled me and continue, I mean, the reason I'm so passionate about this topic is that I really do believe that this is a gesture of social justice, because if I am present to you, if we're present to one another, you know, the trickle effect, the ripple effect, I created a new word, the triple effect of all of this is that it really increases presence, but also understanding and reduces reactivity. So thank you so much for your time and contributing to this conversation. And Brian, sounds like we got some research conversations to continue and some publications to write. Thank you all.